Admiral Brad Cooper chose one quiet word for what the United States had placed over the Strait of Hormuz. He did not call it a blockade, a convoy shield, or a battle line. He called it an umbrella. That almost harmless word now sits at the center of a story Iran never wanted told, because it describes something much larger than protection. It describes the moment when a 40-year doctrine built around mines, missiles, fast boats, and fear was forced to meet a military system designed to see first, strike first, and leave very little room for argument. The strait was supposed to be Tehran's strongest lever. Instead, it became the place where the IRGC discovered that a lever can snap when too much weight is put on it. The chain of events began with a speed that left almost no time for anyone to adjust. On the 28th of February, 2026, the United States and Israel launched strikes against Iranian military targets, including the killing of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Before dawn had fully settled over Tehran, the man who had ruled the Islamic Republic for decades was gone, and the political shock inside Iran quickly turned into military action. The IRGC responded by closing the Strait of Hormuz to foreign shipping. Radio warnings went out to vessels in the waterway. No ship was to pass. For a while, that threat worked exactly as intended. By the 4th of March, Iran had turned the narrow channel into a trap. Warnings, mine-laying, seizures of vessels, and swarm activity by IRGC naval craft combined into a single message to the world. The strait could be shut, and Iran still knew how to shut it. Within days, the effects spread far beyond the Gulf. By the 10th of March, roughly 6 to 7 million barrels per day had vanished from global supply. By the 12th of March, the disruption had passed 10 million barrels per Dalton Y Brent. Crude climbed beyond $120 a barrel, and the energy shock was being described as the largest supply disruption in the history of the oil market. Not the largest in recent memory, the largest ever recorded. That was the IRGC's strategic dream made real. For 4 decades, Iran had studied the geography of Hormuz as if the water itself were a weapon. At its narrowest point, the strait is only 21 nautical miles wide. The shipping channels are cramped. The water is shallow in key places. Mines are cheap, ugly, and terrifyingly effective. Fast attack craft can appear in numbers, move quickly, and force a larger navy to make hard decisions in seconds. Coastal missiles can cover the navigable lanes. Drones can be built cheaply and sent in waves. The logic was simple: make reopening Hormuz so painful that Washington would hesitate. This was not an irrational strategy. It was, in many ways, the most practical asymmetric plan available to Iran. Western analysts had spent years warning that air power alone would not easily solve a mine and swarm denial strategy in confined waters. The strait gave the defender natural advantages. Every tanker that entered the channel became a hostage to uncertainty. Every mine that might be on the seabed changed the calculation. Every small boat approaching at high speed forced crews to decide whether they were looking at a threat, a probe, or a distraction. Iran had read those arguments, built around them, and treated them as proof that its doctrine could hold. What the IRGC had not fully accounted for was the system Cooper later described as an umbrella. Project Freedom was announced as a mission to restore safe passage for commercial shipping, but that public description barely captured the scale of the architecture behind it. This was not an old-style convoy operation, with one destroyer guarding one tanker while small boats looked for seams. It was not a thin line of escorts hoping to react fast enough. It was layered control of air, sea, sensors, communications, and kill chains over one of the most dangerous bodies of water on Earth. 3 American carrier strike groups moved into the Arabian Sea and nearby waters. Together, they carried around 200 fixed-wing aircraft. That number matters because Iran's coastal defense network was designed to complicate the work of a smaller force, not to absorb the attention of hundreds of aircraft operating in a coordinated structure. No doctrine built around harassment, saturation, and local confusion looks the same when the other side can keep aircraft overhead, jam communications, suppress radar, Watch the surface and strike targets before the targets understand that they have been found. The F-35C was the first warning sign that the fight had changed shape. Weeks before Operation Epic Fury officially opened, an F-35C from the USS Abraham Lincoln shot down an Iranian shade drone moving toward the carrier in the Arabian Sea. On paper, it was a small event, one aircraft, one drone, one engagement. In practice, it showed what sensor fusion means when it is no longer a marketing phrase. Radar, infrared, and electronic intelligence were fused into one picture, allowing the jet to identify and engage a low-signature target at range while keeping its own position hidden. Iran's strongest air defense systems had been built for a different kind of target. They were meant to detect aircraft that could be tracked, painted, and engaged through more predictable radar logic. The F-35 does not politely enter that kind of fight. It gathers information without announcing itself, builds a targeting solution passively, and hands the rest of the force a cleaner battlefield against radar sites and coastal surveillance along the Hormuz narrows. Its job was direct: find the sensors, fix the target, and finish the engagement before the operators could build a coherent picture of what was happening. Then came the aircraft that rarely gets the public attention it deserves: the EA-18G Growler. The Growler is not famous because it does not look like the hero of the story. It does not usually win by dramatic dogfights or clean missile shots. It wins by making the other side deaf and blind at the exact moment when sight and coordination matter most. During the campaign, a Growler from the USS Abraham Lincoln was seen carrying a loadout built for a very specific purpose: anti-radiation missiles, air-to-air missiles, fuel tanks, and a tactical jamming pod. That combination turned Iran's radar operators into men facing a cruel choice. If they turned on their radars, the anti-radiation missiles could ride those emissions back to the source. If they shut down to survive, they lost the ability to see, track, and coordinate. Either answer weakened the system: coastal missile batteries, command nodes, surveillance radars, and the communications links tying IRGC small boats together. All depend on access to the electromagnetic spectrum. The Growler's task was to deny that access when the IRGC needed it most. That mattered because Iran's swarm doctrine depends on coordination. A swarm is not just a crowd of boats. It is a timed, multi-axis attack meant to confuse, saturate, and overwhelm. Strip away the communications layer and the swarm becomes something far less elegant: scattered boats with limited knowledge of what the others are doing. The IRGC had designed its fast craft to operate inside a noisy, dangerous, cramped battle space. It had not designed them to operate blind under an umbrella of American sensors, jamming, helicopters, and strike aircraft. Once that coordination layer was weakened, the Apache helicopters changed the picture again. The -64 Apache is not subtle. It does not need to pretend to be anything other than what it is: a heavily armed attack helicopter, built to find and destroy hard targets at close and medium range, with Hellfire missiles, a 30mm cannon, and crews trained for violence measured in seconds. It was a brutal answer to small boats that had lost the ability to move as one organism. American, a -64 Apaches and MH-60 Seahawks were used to destroy Iranian small boats moving toward vessels protected under the umbrella. On the morning of Cooper's briefing, 6 Iranian fast attack craft approached protected shipping. By the time he spoke to reporters, all 6 had been destroyed. Cooper described the result as clinical. That word is almost colder than dramatic language would have been. It suggested the engagement had not been chaotic, desperate, or close. It had been processed. That is the part the ERGC could not ignore. 6 boats were not just 6 boats. They were the visible edge of a doctrine built over decades. The fast boat swarm was supposed to be Iran's great equalizer, the tactic that would make a superpower bleed for every mile of water. Yet, under the umbrella, the swarm generated only a fraction of the pressure it was built to create. Once the radar was suppressed, the communications jammed, and the surface watched from above. The boats became exposed targets in a battle space that no longer favored them. The destruction of those 6 craft was only the most visible moment. The larger collapse had started earlier, during Operation Epic Fury. That operation began at 1:15 Eastern Time on the 28th of February. And in the first 24 hours, American B-2 bombers, stealth fighters, reconnaissance aircraft, and other platforms hit more than 1,000 targets across Iran. 1,000 targets in one day is not a raid. It is an attempt to dismantle command, logistics, sensors, weapons, and naval infrastructure faster than the opposing system can understand the scale of its own damage. The naval losses were severe. More than 120 Iranian naval vessels across both the regular Iranian Navy and the IRGC Navy were destroyed or disabled. Then came the event that cut through decades of naval history. On the 4th of March, the Iranian ship Dana was struck by a torpedo launched from a U.S. Navy submarine and sank off the coast of Sri Lanka. Some of the crew were rescued, but the ship was gone. It had been one of Iran's newer vessels and had been returning home after participating in a multinational naval exercise. The symbolism was enormous. The U.S. Navy had not sunk an enemy warship in direct combat since the end of World War II for 81 years. That threshold had remained untouched through Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War, the Gulf War, and many other confrontations. The IRGC had built part of its confidence on the belief that the United States might threaten, sanction, strike from the air, or maneuver at sea, but would hesitate before crossing that line. The Dana proved that assumption could be wrong in one torpedo track. Further losses followed. By the 11th of March, U.S. Central Command said all 4 ships of the Shahid Soleimani-class corvette fleet had been removed from the fight. These were among the IRGC Navy's more advanced surface combatants, combining speed, radar, air defense, and anti-ship capability in a semi-stealth profile. Iran's converted drone carrier, the Shahid Bagheri, had been hit early in the operation, removing a sea-based platform for long-range unmanned attacks before it could operate at scale. The message was not subtle. The Navy Iran, built to dominate Hormuz, could be dismantled outside Hormuz as well. President Trump later claimed that Iran's Navy had been annihilated, saying 158 Iranian vessels had been destroyed, and that no Iranian ship remained underway in the Arabian Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz, or the Gulf of Oman, even if every number deserves careful scrutiny, the operational meaning was clear. The IRGC Navy, the force designed to make the strait too expensive for America to contest, had suffered the kind of damage that changes planning assumptions for years. A destroyed boat can be replaced. A destroyed belief is harder to rebuild. Still, the real picture was not simply American dominance from start to finish. That would be too neat. And the Strait of Hormuz does not reward neat stories. By July 2026, despite the ceasefire and the Memorandum of Understanding, Iran still retained roughly half of its pre-war assets. More importantly, about half of its missile launchers were still assessed to be intact. The nuclear file remained even more unsettling. A classified assessment found that the strikes had set Iran's nuclear program back by less than 6 months, not eliminated it. Iran was also believed to hold around 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. Enough for roughly 10 weapons, if enriched further to weapons grade. The centrifuge capacity to complete that next step could exist on a timeline measured in weeks if the political decision were made. That is why the umbrella cannot be mistaken for a final answer. It solved one kind of military problem with great force and precision. It did not erase every buried launcher, every tunnel, every drone workshop, or every kilogram of enriched material. The mine problem was even uglier. Mines are not glamorous, but they may be the most stubborn part of the whole crisis. The Pentagon told Congress that clearing the strait could take 6 months, and only after major fighting had stopped. Mine clearance under fire was assessed as too dangerous. Worse, Iran reportedly lost track of some of the mines it had laid. That detail should sit heavily. A state planted explosives in a waterway that carries a huge share of the world's oil, then could not fully account for where all of them were. That is why reopening the strait was never as simple as announcing that it was open. Even when Tehran had an incentive to say the waterway was safe, it could not guarantee that safety. By April, thousands of mariners and ships were stranded in the Persian Gulf, trapped not only by politics, but by metal objects on the seabed whose locations were not completely known. Mine warfare has always had that grim logic. It is cheap to begin, slow to undo, and indifferent to ceasefire language. Meanwhile, the United States introduced another surprise, the Lucas drone, a low-cost unmanned combat attack system modeled on the same basic idea that had made Iranian one-way attack drones so irritating and effective. In other words, America took a concept Iran had used for years, refined it, and sent it back across the battlefield. The cost equation began to shift. Iran had once benefited from forcing expensive defensive systems to respond to cheap drones. Now low-cost American drones were being used against Iranian missile sites, naval targets, and hardened facilities. Unmanned surface craft also entered the picture. Small, fast autonomous reconnaissance vessels patrolled the waters, logging hundreds of hours and thousands of nautical miles while watching for small boat movement, mine laying, and other threats. Add them to the wider picture, and the umbrella becomes easier to understand. Unmanned boats watched the surface. Drones watched from the air. F-35s moved unseen. Growlers jammed and hunted radars. Apaches waited for boats that broke through the outer layers. This was not one weapon beating one doctrine. It was a system pressing down another system until the weaker assumptions cracked. The lesson for every Navy watching was uncomfortable. The old debate about whether ships, aircraft, drones, or missiles matter most suddenly looked too simple. What mattered was connection, the force that could collect data, share it, protect it, jam the enemy's data, and act on it fastest controlled the fight. Iran had many dangerous pieces, but those pieces depended on narrow channels of communication and timing. Once those channels were disrupted, the pieces stopped reinforcing one another. The American umbrella did not merely destroy targets. It broke the rhythm that made those targets dangerous in the first place. By the 6th of July, 2026, the political situation was no cleaner than the military one. A memorandum of understanding had been signed at Versailles on the 17th of June by Trump and Iranian President Pezeshkian. On the 19th of June, Trump announced a renewed ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. Within a day, Iran again said it had closed the strait, citing Israeli actions in Lebanon as a violation of the agreement. Then the situation cooled briefly, only to heat up again almost immediately. On 25th of June, an IRGC drone struck the Singapore flagged vessel Ever Lovely. 2 days later, another drone hit the Panama flagged tanker Mount Kiku. CENTCOM responded by striking 10 Iranian military targets. Iran fired missiles and drones at bases in Kuwait and Bahrain, and a residential building in Maharak, Bahrain was hit. After that, both sides stepped back just enough to allow technical talks in Doha. That is the strange rhythm of the current conflict: ceasefire on paper, exchanges in practice, and every side, claiming the same agreement, justifies its own actions. For commercial shipping, that kind of uncertainty is almost as damaging as open war. Tanker operators do not make decisions from flags and press conferences alone. They look at premiums, risk corridors, crew safety, port delays, and the chance that one more drone strike will turn a profitable voyage into a political incident. That is why the strait can remain economically wounded, even when the shooting slows down. A formal reopening means little if captains, insurers, and owners still behave as if the channel is half closed. The IRGC understands that gap between law and behavior very well. It is one of the few forms of leverage that survives even after radar sites burn and boats sink. The strait itself remained dangerous. Roughly 80 mines were still believed to be in the central channel. A joint Hormuz committee met in Muscat to discuss demining procedures, but Iran insisted the work should be handled by Iran alone. France and Oman pushed for international participation, while Tehran told France to stay out. The UAE State Oil Company reportedly did not expect full flows through Hormuz to return until 2027. That estimate says more than any diplomatic statement. Insurance markets listen less to speeches than to damaged tankers. In May, the IRGC Navy announced that Iran had redefined the Strait of Hormuz as a broader operational area, instead of treating it only as the narrow corridor around Hormuz and Hengam Islands. Iranian officials described a larger strategic zone running from Jask to Siri Island. That was doctrine trying to fill the space left by damaged hardware. When ships are gone, radar sites are destroyed, and confidence is shaken. Maps become a kind of weapon. Draw a larger zone, declare authority over it, and hope policy can buy time for capability to return. But doctrine eventually needs hardware again. That is where the long-term question becomes more dangerous than the daily headlines. The IRGC's conventional naval doctrine was tested and found unable to deliver the result it was built to produce. Fast boats were destroyed quickly. A frigate was sunk far from home. Advanced corvettes were removed from the fight. Radar and command nodes were stripped away. Yet the people shaping Iran's next doctrine are not likely to be moderates searching for graceful defeat. After Khamenei's death, harder-line figures from within the IRGC became more influential. And institutional memory did not vanish with the fleet. Iran still has underground missile bases, buried deep in the Zagros and Alborz mountain ranges, connected by tunnel systems built over many years. It still has drones, because drones are cheap, dispersed, and hard to eliminate completely. It still has mines. It still has missiles. It still has enriched uranium. It still has a revolutionary guard structure that has spent decades seeing the strait not only as water, but as political leverage. Losing a round does not necessarily make such an institution more cautious. Sometimes, it makes it more determined to find a tool the other side cannot so easily neutralize. That is why the post-war balance is so unstable. Iran lost much of its surface fleet, the confidence of global shipping insurers, key radar infrastructure, and the comfortable assumption that America would not fully contest the strait. It also lost senior IRGC naval leadership and the prestige of a doctrine it had spent decades defending. But it retained enough capability to remain dangerous in ways that do not require a clean naval battle. Mines do not need radar. Drones do not need expensive bases. Underground launchers do not care how many aircraft are circling above the water. Iran's parliament moved in May to formalize controls over Hormuz traffic, a political act that revealed something important. Governments do not codify control over a waterway if they have accepted that they no longer control it. Tehran appeared to read the memorandum as giving it administrative authority over the strait, while Washington read the situation differently. On the 27th of June, the Joint Maritime Information Center, overseen by the U.S. Navy, announced a widened route near Oman to increase traffic in both directions. America published a route. Iran rejected unauthorized transit. A tanker was hit. America struck Iranian targets. Iran hit back in the region. The talks continued anyway, because in the Gulf, diplomacy and violence often share the same calendar. Under all of that, one structural fact remains. The IRGC cannot defeat the United States in a direct conventional naval engagement. The umbrella proved that. The 6 fast boats proved it. The Dana proved it. 200 aircraft over 21 miles of water proved it in a language nobody in the region needed translated. But Iran does not have to win a conventional battle to keep leverage. It only has to create enough cost, uncertainty, delay, and risk that shipping companies, insurers, energy buyers, and politicians begin adjusting around. Iranian pressure. That is the part that makes the strait so hard to tame. A mine does not need to shoot down an F-35. It only needs to sit quietly in a shipping lane and force a tanker operator to ask whether the trip is worth the premium. A drone does not need to sink an aircraft carrier. It only needs to hit a tanker often enough to keep insurance rates high. An underground missile site does not need to fire every day. It only needs to survive long enough to remain part of every calculation. The IRGC's fast boat doctrine may have been broken, but the tools of disruption remain. That difference between defeat and removal is the trap in this story. Iran was defeated in the visible naval contest, but it was not removed from the strategic equation. The United States proved it could force open a path, punish attacks, and dismantle surface forces at a pace Iran could not match yet. Forcing open a path is not the same as making the water normal again. Normal is when shipping companies stop calculating war risk before every transit. Normal is when mines are counted, cleared, and certified. Normal is when a drone strike no longer has the power to shake energy markets before breakfast. Hormuz is not back to normal. It is under management, and management is not victory. Project Freedom therefore demonstrated something permanent, but incomplete. It showed that the old Iranian assumption was wrong. America was willing to pay the price of contesting the strait, and it was willing to do so with overwhelming force. Stealth aircraft, electronic warfare, helicopters, unmanned systems, and submarines. The umbrella opened, and the swarm did not survive beneath it. But the same operation also revealed that no umbrella can remove every mine from the seabed, every launcher from a tunnel, or every political incentive for Tehran to keep using Hormuz as leverage. The question now is what the IRGC learns. It may conclude that conventional naval power in the strait is no longer a reliable tool and shift deeper into mines, drones, legal claims, insurance pressure, and low-cost attrition. Or it may reach a darker conclusion that the only deterrent powerful enough to make another Project Freedom unthinkable is the nuclear capability, still sitting just short of the final threshold. That is not an academic question. It is likely being argued inside the IRGC right now, in rooms where the loss of ships is measured against the survival of tunnels, missiles, uranium, and political control. So the umbrella remains the image that defines this crisis. It was calm language for an overwhelming military system. It protected shipping, exposed the limits of Iran's naval doctrine, and shattered a belief that had guided the IRGC for 40 years. Yet below that umbrella, the water is still seated with mines behind the coastline. Launchers still hide in mountains. Somewhere in underground halls, centrifuges still turn. The fast boats were gone before breakfast, but the next doctrine is already being written, and that may be the real story the world has to watch now.